Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining the Inkspot podcast. And Guy, thank you for appearing. So I have a signed copy of Guy's book, The World Within, which is about retreat, especially in relation to three extremely unique individuals. But it's not your first book, is it, Guy? You wrote another book about a very personal journey you made from the UK to Jerusalem.
Yes, that's right. My first book was called The Crossway, and it was an account of walking from, as you say, Canterbury via Rome and Istanbul to Jerusalem.
And the thing that was so notable about this trip is that you stayed in all cases with relying on the kindness of strangers. Is that correct?
That's right. So along the way, I stayed in monasteries and in convents. I stayed with priests and on the floors of churches. But I also stayed with strangers who welcomed me into their homes, offered me a bed, offered me some food for the night. And this happened right across Europe, France and Switzerland, Italy, and the Balkans, and then into the Middle East.
That's amazing. And you never had to sort of tout for it. It just sort of seemed to come your way. Is that
Well, what often happened was that each night when I arrived in a village, I started walking in winter, which was not a very sensible idea logistically.
I don't think that any of this was sensible.
But it meant that it was too cold for me to camp out. And so instead, I had a list of various monasteries and places along the route. But the problem was, because I was walking in winter, the days are very short. And if I went the wrong way, I took a wrong turning, it was often quite a struggle to reach these destinations, these refuges, which might be many, many kilometers apart. But after a few days, I realized that if I went to a village and I found the church, normally there'd be someone vaguely connected with the church, maybe a priest, maybe just a volunteer. And I told them what I was doing, and I explained that I needed some help, then almost always somebody would be found who was willing to help me.
Yes. Well, that makes sense if it's a church connection, or, that totally makes sense. And what sort of equipment did you have with you? What did you carry?
Well, I wanted to try to make the journey as similar to a medieval pilgrimage as possible, which is obviously a somewhat ludicrous ambition. And so...
And another not very sensible.
Yes. And while I wasn't wearing, medieval dress, I had contemporary hiking clothes, contemporary rucksack. I tried not to use a phone to navigate. This was a while ago now, and so phone navigation was a bit less good. But either way, I tried to just use maps, and where the maps were less good, I would just ask directions from the people I met along the way. And so it was quite low tech in that regard. And obviously I tried to get away with carrying as little as possible, given that I had this rucksack for 10 months.
So what did you find was absolutely essential on your trip? Or were you able to really strip back what any one of us would imagine we really needed?
I think there were two things that were essential for me. The first was, this is rather a basic answer, but the first was food. You're walking between 6 and 8, 9 hours a day. You're often going over hills, mountains. As I said, I started walking in the cold. So just getting enough calories to keep going each day was a challenge. But there were a few
things.
To
keep yourself warm, I imagine, especially in the winter.
To keep yourself warm. And then in the summer, enough water to keep yourself hydrated. But there were a few things more, in that state, there are a few things more pleasurable than a big plate of pasta, or, refilling your water bottle after it's been empty for several hours. And then
when you really need it,
yeah,
that's the thing,
exactly.
and you've
Exactly.
earned it.
The amount you take pleasure in food or drink, I think is correlated to how hungry or thirsty you are, independent of how tasty it might be. And then the second thing was reading material. So I had a Kindle with me, and I had originally had the idea that I would only read very demanding works of literature. But when I was, or the King James Bible, but when I was feeling cold and sad and lonely, there was nothing more comforting to me than reading Sherlock Holmes stories. Stories I'd first encountered when I was a boy or a teenager, and it really felt, made me feel like I was back at home again in some way to read these little stories before I went to sleep.
That's amazing. So food and reading materials, which is actually very medieval in itself. So
True.
yeah. And I love that idea of this ties in very nicely with The World Within. I'll just show the cover again, because you were on a sort of moving retreat, weren't you? In essence, you'd left your life behind, and you were, I suppose, every day encountering strangers who would know nothing about you. And so there's a kind of anonymity about it, I suppose, which allows you to decide how much to share or how much to engage. And that, but it must have, and also I love the idea of you retreating into the stories that were familiar to you and that reminded you of childhood, or, and so is that what gave you the spark to write The World Within?
Yes, you're exactly right about the parallels between pilgrimage and retreat. In a way, they're the same experience, but just achieved via a different method. So, as you identified, in both cases, you suspend your everyday life, you leave that life behind, and you make a journey, both an external journey, but also an internal journey. And what's different, I think, about a pilgrimage to a hiking holiday, or a retreat to just going to stay in a hotel for a few days or a few weeks, is this wish and this deliberate intention that the journey will change you in some way, even if you don't know quite how that might be. So I was certainly that completing this walk, this pilgrimage, made me more interested about retreat, curious to know more about retreat. But then another thing that sparked this book was the experience of lockdown. So, like many people during the lockdown, I was cut off from friends and family. In some ways, your everyday life is suspended, your identity is put on hold. And so I felt as if lockdown was giving us all a taste of retreat. And what I was interested to notice in myself is that as a writer, I'm used to solitude, and my work in many ways is very well suited to the lockdown. So I expected to find the experience a doddle. I thought I wouldn't even notice anything had changed. But in fact, I found the lockdown harder than I expected. And it made me began asking questions about retreat. I'd had some glimpse of the benefits of retreat, but now I began asking questions about the costs. And while I thought to myself, well, I can go on some retreats myself and I can explore it in this way, that doesn't seem quite interesting enough to sustain a book. Unlike pilgrimage, retreat is a bit less a dramatic activity. And so in order to broaden this question out, I began thinking about other people who'd retreated. And I eventually settled on 3 writers, artists, thinkers who were very important to me and for whom retreat had played a very important part in their lives.
And they paid a price for it, as you alluded to. The cost was, quite enormous in terms of their mental and, I suppose, physical health too.
Yes. So just to introduce the three figures, one of them is Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's the Austrian philosopher. Another was David Jones, a Welsh poet and painter. And a third is Simone Weil, the French mystical writer. And all three of these figures, at moments of crisis in their life, when they were struggling with depression, with migraines, with a collapsing marriage, with personal crises, and when they were close to despair, they decided to spend time on retreat. They decided to spend time living with religious communities. And what I felt as I studied both their lives and their work was that they gave an insight into, yes, the rewards of retreat and the value it can play in producing creative work, but as you've also alluded to, the costs of retreat, and in particular, the effect it can have on a human life.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, the three figures that you chose, because as well as retreat, I think they share this totally uncompromising quality towards their work and towards their life. And, that is, do you think that's coincidental, or do you think that is like integral to the idea of someone who would seek a retreat?
Yeah, yes, they're like monks and nuns, but rather than devoting their lives to God, they've devoted their lives to art or to ideas. And I think many of us have romantic ideas about the creative life. In some cases, it might be the rock and roll lifestyle. You can think of poets, musicians who have lived in it.
Lord Byron.
Exactly, yeah. Who've lived in that extreme decadent way. But there's also another example, which is the artist who sacrifices everything for their work, who potentially surrenders a home, a family, a stable career, relationships, whether that's romantic or with friends, gives up all of these things in order to pursue their calling, to use a religious word. And I, like many people, found this example inspiring, and even at times believed it was the only way to create great work, or that a true genius would live in this very devoted, austere way. But one of the things that I was able to do when writing this book and when spending time with these characters was to unpick those ideas a little bit, to ask whether, in order to create these great works, these figures had to live these very sacrificial lives, or whether at times this way of living made it harder for them to either produce work or, on a simpler level, be happy.
That's a really good question, isn't it? But taking Wittgenstein first, I mean, he came from a very unusual family. And in fact, that's true of all of them, isn't it? Especially, I suppose, David Jones less so, but Wittgenstein and Simone Weil came from very intellectual backgrounds, didn't they?
Yeah.
And in Wittgenstein's case, an unbelievably wealthy family, which he completely, he just jettisoned all worldly wealth. He just did not want to have anything to do with it. And
yes,
so again, this uncompromising quality, which,
So Wittgenstein, one of the things he was retreating from was his family and his background. As you say, he was born into one of the wealthiest families in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father was this dominating steel magnate who then became a major philanthropist, a patron of the arts. He had many siblings. And although this was obviously a privileged life, it was a life that he found suffocating. And I should also mention that several of his siblings seem to have found it suffocating as well. So famously, 2 of his older brothers committed suicide.
Yes, I remember.
And
Reading about
yes,
it, that
and then
is.
a third sort of disappeared in mysterious circumstances. So there was obviously something oppressive about this upbringing. And he escaped first by going to Berlin to study, then by coming to Britain to study. But when he was in Cambridge under Bertrand Russell, he found something about academic life was also, he thought, stultifying, prevented the ability to create original work. So his first retreat was to Norway. He went to find a tiny little village at the end of a long fjord. He spent several years working there. Then, with the outbreak of the First World War, he went back to Austria, enlisted in the army as a private, and after a few years was sent to the front at his own request. He said that he wanted to confront his fear. And then, at the end of the war, he was a prisoner of war, but when he finally came back to Vienna, he had this dramatic moment of cutting ties with his family, of refusing his inheritance, and then eventually going to spend 7 years teaching in remote mountain schools in the Austrian Alps. And in between these two moments, the break with his family and the decision to go and teach, or the teaching career, he spent a summer working as a gardener in a monastery just outside Vienna called Kloster Neuburg. So one part of the book contains an account of this period in his life and my own visit to the monastery to see what it was like today. The religious community still lived there. To see what it was like today and to get some sense of what Wittgenstein was doing as a guard, one of the wealthiest men in Austria, working as a gardener in a monastery. I mean, what was he doing there? What was he hoping to get out of it? And did he find it?
I suppose, gardening, while it can be quite strenuous, it's also a very contemplative activity. And it means you can do something while your mind is engaged on thinking. Maybe that's what he found so attractive about it. I don't know whether he ever wrote anything about enjoying gardening or whether he just did it as a means to get by. Or
he doesn't write about enjoying gardening, although much later in his life, when he's a fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, he writes several strongly worded letters about various changes to the Fellows' Garden. So he obviously had views on the correct way to plant a herbaceous border or something.
I suppose he'd really earned the right to do that.
Unlike most of the Fellows, he had at least worked as a gardener. But he does write in one of his letters at the time. So at the time, he was suicidally depressed. His letters contain regular references to wanting to kill himself. And part of the reason for this is that he'd had a very close romantic, although it's not clear whether or not it was consummated, but romantic relationship with a young man he'd met at Cambridge, a young British man who had died during the First World War. So he was distraught by the death of this young man, Pinsent. He also had completed his first major work of philosophy, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, but he'd been unable to find a publisher, and he was very disappointed about the initial response to this book that later became one of the sort of seminal works of 20th century philosophy.
Incredible, yes.
But at the time, he was feeling a failure. He was feeling deeply depressed, and so he goes to the monastery in part to get away from things, but also because, as he writes in the letter, he wanted physically demanding work. And the reason for that was at the end of each day, when he returned to the potting shed where he was sleeping each night, as he phrases it, he was too tired to feel sad anymore. He'd exhausted his physical energy, and that actually had in some way quieted his mind. So Wittgenstein's retreat, even though he's an intellectual, his retreat was in a way an attempt to get away from his thoughts, to get away from philosophy, and to quiet his mind.
But interesting, but again, going back to the contemplative aspect of something like gardening, while your conscious mind is engaged on the problem, like for example, how many shrubs you're going to plant in area A, your subconscious is busy on other things, and obviously this must have, this must have really affected his thinking and improved it. I think. But again, going back to this total uncompromising aspect to Wittgenstein is when he tried to publish that book and it was refused, he refused to change it on the grounds that either it was a spectacularly brilliant book which would succeed, or it was worthless, in which case it didn't deserve to succeed, which again is like, for a writer, astonishing, isn't it? To have, on the one hand, such confidence and such humility at the same time.
Yes, I think you've caught something, a paradox almost in Wittgenstein's character, but it's one that can be found in the characters of the other two subjects of the book.
Yes.
This mysterious combination of absolute certainty about how they want to work and the effects they're trying to achieve in their work, combined with vulnerability, self-doubt, and at times despair. Now, as you say, Wittgenstein wasn't prepared to compromise over his philosophical work, but nonetheless, if you read his letters, you do find plenty of examples of him despairing about his life. You encounter the sense that he had no idea how to live, or whether what he was doing was the right way to live, or whether it would make him happy. You get a sense that he may well have been a genius in philosophy, but on the subject of living, he had no more insight than the rest of us did. And I find that in a strange way reassuring, because to me, what it means is that you don't necessarily have to live one of these punishingly austere lives if you have creative ambitions, and that these lives, although they are inspiring in some ways, are also filled with mistakes and sort of self-defeating decisions.
And terrible suffering, probably needless suffering as well. Although I suppose with Wittgenstein, is his family, obviously there must have been a very big depressive streak there, as you alluded to earlier, and also quite a dysfunctional family environment for, and maybe the combination of the two was really overwhelming. But I suppose when I was younger, I shared that idea, that romantic idea of suffering for your art and, etc. Whereas now I really realize that most of it is just about showing up, bum on seat, and just getting on with it and carving time out of your day to make sure that happens, no matter what else is going on in your life.
And if there's too much suffering, it makes it much harder to find that time.
Exactly. Or you need distance from the suffering before you can even pick up a pen. So, yeah. So I suppose that before we move on to the other two, one thing I wanted to ask you is, I read somewhere that during the war, Wittgenstein, he volunteered, and he volunteered for the most dangerous work because it was almost a way of testing himself and testing his own courage. And I read somewhere years ago that during the heat of battle, he suddenly had an illuminating idea, and he had to stop whatever he was doing and quickly rush to the side of the battlefield and scribble it down. And I can't find this anecdote anywhere. And I wondered if you must have done so much research on him. I wondered if you knew where I'd seen this, or did I just make it up?
I've heard that anecdote repeated in the popular culture at various times. Okay. I think there's a film that I can't remember the name of, which sort of repeats this story as well.
Okay.
Sadly, it is a story or at least I can find no evidence of him literally, as the shells are falling, as the bullets are flying, turning his back on the enemy and scribbling in his notebooks.
But if anyone were to do it, it would be him,
But
right?
it's not miles away from what happened, which is that every night he volunteered to. He was basically, his job was to go out into an observation post at night, and when a shot was fired, there would be the flare from the gun, which would enable the artillery on his own side to more precisely locate where the enemy forces were. But in order to do this job, you have to be out ahead of the rest of your forces in essentially undefended no man's land. And so it was a very dangerous role. And as you say, he wanted to confront fear, partially to see how he reacted, but more deeply to loosen some of his attachment to life. So in a way that sounds vaguely Buddhist, he felt as if his attachment to life, his desire to remain alive, and the fear he felt in the face of death was in some way an intellectual failing, and that the only way of overcoming this was by repeatedly exposing himself to that danger. And it was as a result of this repeated exposure to danger that his sense of the religious shifted slightly. He'd been baptized, he'd grown up, his family was predominantly Jewish. He was baptized as Catholic when he was young. He'd become an atheist as a teenager. While a student under Bertrand Russell, he was fairly committed, fairly convinced non-believer. But at the start of the war, his views on religion had begun to change. And what this repeated exposure to death and danger did to him was it made it easier for him to surrender the idea that he had control over his life. And this was attached in his mind to a sort of spiritual insight, which is that if you, as a believer, believe that God has control over the course your life takes, and if you can sort of trust God in that respect, then you're going to be less attached to any particular outcome, because you're going to just assume that it's in some way part of the divine will or the divine plan. And this insight, which he, I think you could argue, understood in quite an embodied way by going to the front like this. This insight and this change of perspective on religion ultimately influenced the Tractatus, because the early drafts of that book, written before the war, have no spiritual content whatsoever. And then famously, the last pages of that book, which up until then had been an almost mathematical book in its rigid logical analysis of language, start talking about concepts such as morality and mysticism. And it was these spiritual insights that were achieved during the war that were responsible for that change of direction the book takes.
Interesting. I suppose if a person has exposed themselves to danger so much and has lived to tell the tale, then that actually makes it more likely that they will become a believer. Just, maybe just on the pure odds involved. I don't know.
Maybe. I think after the First and the Second World War, there were certainly rises in the number of believers and the number of practicing worshippers. There are many theories as to why that was. I suspect the answer is a combination of several different factors. But for people who'd experienced the front, then as a way of making sense of what they'd experienced, I'm sure that was part of the motivation.
Yes, I'm sure. And this brings us to David Jones, who also had a first-hand experience of war. And he's probably the least known of the three. And in fact, before I read your book, I'd never come across David Jones. And so why did you choose him?
So David Jones is primarily a painter. Over the course of his life, produced many watercolors, some of them very beautiful. But watercolor, in essence, is not really a blockbuster artistic style. As and oil paints, watercolors just don't.
Not a Caravaggio.
Exactly, they just don't reproduce very well. And even the originals, although beautiful, are often quite quiet and gentle in their effects. So if you want to be a well-known artist, don't just produce watercolors. But the reason that one of the reasons he was of interest to me is that as well as producing watercolors, he wrote a number of poems, the most famous of which is In Parenthesis. And In Parenthesis is a long poem about the First World War. Many critics, including figures like W.H. Auden and T.S. Eliot, think it's perhaps the great long poem of the 20th century, certainly in English, one of the great poems about war comparable to the Iliad. But it's not very well known. And I think part of the reason for that, at school in England, children always study the war poets. They study Wilfred Owen, they study Siegfried Sassoon. And these poets, on the whole, wrote short, simple, moving accounts of the war, which are a brilliant way into the subject in a history lesson or an English lesson.
The ecstasy of fumbling.
Exactly.
For example.
Yes, gas, quick lads, and an ecstasy of fumbling. But David Jones, In Parenthesis, David Jones's great poem, it's just not quotable in the same way. It's hard to study. It's hard to take extracts from. It's a long poem in a mix of poetry and prose. It has a lot of slang to reproduce the sort of jargon and language of Tommies, of Cockney working class Tommies. And then underneath it all, it has this religious symbolism, which makes it quite a daunting poem to study, even as a graduate or postgraduate student, let alone while at school. And as a result, I just don't think people, even though David Jones spent longer at the front than any of the those well-known officer poets, and he fought in some of its major conflicts, he's not a very immediately easy or digestible poet, and that makes him a bit. I don't think he'll ever therefore be as famous as some of those other war poets. But having said that, what interested me as well as the work and as well as the poetry was his life. So he was born into a sort of respectable working class family in London, but with Welsh ancestry. He was an artistic prodigy, so he went to art school while still in his early teens. His studies were interrupted by the war, and so he went and fought in the war, was badly injured several times, but spent many, many weeks on the front line, on the Western Front. And after the end of the war, he went back to art school, but during the war he had been exposed to Catholicism. It had had a powerful effect on him. After the war, he converted, and he was now wrestling with what to do with his life, whether to be an artist or whether he had some religious calling which he needed to pursue. And so he spent much of his late 20s and early 30s spending time either with religious communities or with artistic communities that had a religious character to them, or moving between his parents in London and various remote parts of the countryside, essentially trying to find an original artistic style. And also in the latter, into his kind of mid-30s, trying to turn these experiences he'd had of war into art, trying to set them down on the page and make them into something beautiful.
Interesting. And so he retreated as well. And you went to the island where he chose for his retreat. In fact, you went to all the places, didn't you, where
Yes,
all three of your subjects decided to retreat?
I did. And in the case of David Jones, he went to Caldy Island, which is off the coast of Wales, and where there is now there is a monastery on that island. When Jones went, it was occupied by Benedictines. It's now occupied by Trappists. But the interesting thing about the island is that it's small enough that almost anywhere you stand, you're very aware of the sea and the sky around you. And
so you hear it even if your eyes are
exactly,
closed.
yes. And because it's an island, it's exposed enough that you're very aware of the elements. And David Jones at this point he'd spent some time living with another community in the Welsh borders. He'd begun trying to create paintings of the Welsh landscape. And the style that he developed while he was at art school was inadequate to conveying the effect the landscape had on him. When he was living in the Welsh borders, there was a closeness to the hills, which encouraged him to leave behind traditional perspective and create sketches that had a looseness and a freedom to their perspective, which made them more and more, you wouldn't say abstract, but certainly more modern. And this effect continued when he was living on Caldy Island. So he visited the monastery once and then kept going back there, kept going back to the island, and kept trying to paint the sea because he basically felt that he couldn't quite capture it. But over time, his paintings became looser and looser. The boundaries became looser so that land and sea blend together, that the crest of the waves and the curling of the foliage on the shore, these echo one another and intermingle. And this loosening of style not only allowed him to develop his mature style as a painter, but also towards the latter part of his 30s, had him recognized as one of the leading experimental artists of the interwar period.
Maybe just by practicing and spending the time, he just absorbed some sort of quality from the sea or the land or the weather and the interaction of all three that, other painters would not have the time and the luxury to absorb.
Yes, and that's tied very closely to the example of monasticism, as I realized when I visited the island. Monks, and especially Trappist monks, some of the strictest monks, in a way, their job is to pray. And so they spend, as much 7 or more hours a day in church, chanting, praying. And what this requires is, first of all, an ability to live with a sort of disciplined routine. But then also, it requires a very high patience, capacity for boredom, ability to focus on quite small, quite simple, even quite mundane things, and to keep focusing on them until they begin to reveal maybe a depth or a richness that wasn't there on the superficial impression, on the initial glance. And similarly, Jones, when he was on the island, was able to work in a very steady, regular fashion and was able to keep attempting to draw the same bays, the same effects of air and water and light, and over time give his style an intensity and a liveliness that was not there at the start.
Was he still painting in watercolors all the time? He never changed his medium?
Earlier on, he produced engravings. Later on, the watercolors would sometimes have gouache and other painting materials in them, but he never really left behind this medium to become an oil painter.
And didn't he do things on glass as well? You mentioned engravings before. Was it engraved glass that he did?
No, so
Or
while he was on the island, he became good friends with one of the monks who was a stained glass artist.
that's
And
it,
this
yeah.
monk was, in many ways, an impressive scholar and artist, but seemingly was also quite difficult to live with. And so had actually been given a little hermitage, a cottage all to themselves on the far side of the monastic enclosure. So the other monks found this individual difficult to live with. But David Jones found a friend and someone he could learn from. And I argue in the book that this directly influenced his style, because much of the effect that stained glass can achieve is the effect of the surface plus light. It's not really the same as painting conventionally, because you're always thinking, what will the effect be when light comes through this surface? The surface you're working on is porous. And even though Jones was painting on paper, his work is often able to catch something of that translucence you find in stained glass. So in much of his later work, he literally includes glass. So there was a period of time when he was after he had what we would now call PTSD, and at various points in his life, this caused collapses that made it very hard for him to go outside. And so, although he was primarily a landscape painter, he'd have to paint these landscapes from inside. And so would incorporate the glass walls or glass windows of his studio into his paintings. But even the paintings that are not painted inside, they still, the light works in an enchanting and beguiling way, because the solid surfaces have something of the translucence one finds in a piece of stained glass.
Interesting. What I'll try and do after this is over is find some links to his work to include in the description below, which, because it would be really interesting to see exactly what you've just described.
Yes,
So,
yeah, and there are some very interesting paintings that, particularly of the Welsh landscape, that either on Caldy or when he was in the Welsh borders, that were produced around this time.
But you've just introduced another paradox, and that is a landscape painter who is agoraphobic.
Yes.
This is poor man. This is terrible. So, and also his personal relationships really suffered, didn't they? He had a very unhappy engagement, I recall, and I suppose it was very difficult for him to relate to other people, wasn't it?
Yes. So he, on the one hand, was a gregarious and sociable person. He made many friends over the course of his life. He was a brilliant correspondent with some of them. He had various patrons and protectors. He had many admirers as an artist and a poet. But on the other hand, he had a strong impulse to withdraw from society. This was partly due to the mental health problems, the ongoing mental health problems that really haunted his life ever since the end of the war.
Do you think it was definitely the war that caused that, or do you think there was an element from prior to the war, in the same way that Wittgenstein would have carried forward into his life?
I don't think there are biographical sources in his family that are as obvious as sources of suffering in his family that are as obvious as with Wittgenstein. I think the war is largely to blame, but the war is maybe not a full explanation of specifically his romantic relationships. So he was engaged to Petra Gill, the daughter of Eric Gill, who was a sculptor, letter typesetter, and founded one of the artistic religious communities that he spent time living with. Their engagement lasted several years, but it was clear that David Jones was struggling to commit to the actual idea of marriage. And eventually Petra broke off the engagement to marry someone else, leaving David Jones
Fair enough, I
heartbroken.
suppose. You can only wait so long,
Yes,
can't you?
I think she correctly identified that he ultimately did not want a family and did not want the kind of responsibilities that a family may result in. That what he really wanted to do was to commit himself fully to his art and potentially not even be distracted by a wife, a partner. Why? Well, after the failed engagement, he told friends that he had he was committed now to the solitary model of the artistic life, the monastic model of the artistic life. He seemed very certain that his art and a relationship would not be, those two things could not be possible. And even though he had one and maybe more crushes in later life, these were never acted on. So there was something in him that was unable to commit, possibly afraid of romantic obligation, and convinced that a romantic life and a creative life, that love for work and love for a person came from the same source, and therefore if you were directing that love towards people, your work would in some way suffer. He seemed to believe that quite deeply, but I don't think the war explains that. And yet, nonetheless, it certainly contributed to the loneliness of his later life.
Well, who was it who said that the pram in the hallway was the biggest block to create?
That was Cyril Connolly, who was also, writing at a similar time, was part of a similar generation. And this is obviously, these three characters are extreme examples. They're extreme in the way that they reject family life and romantic love. But they are extreme examples of an instinct that many creative figures have, which is that in order to work as well as, that their work is in some way all-consuming, and that in order to work as well as possible, they have to give all of themselves to it. But that obviously makes it hard to commit to the other important things in life. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask in this book was, is that true? Is it necessary that in order to create great work, you have to give all of yourself to it? And is it also true that if you sacrifice all those other things, that what is the price one pays for sacrificing all those other things?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. But coming actually, it's in one before we come to Simone Weil. One of the things that really struck me about all three of these characters is how incredibly, obviously, bright they were, very creative, very special people in many ways. And none of them had children. And so therefore, these amazing genes just died out, which I think is terribly sad, for humanity, I suppose. But as you say, again, the link with monasticism is that they were married to their work in the same way that a monk or a nun would be married to God, and is all consuming. And therefore, I suppose maybe if they had children, those kids would have probably been desperately unhappy. Who knows?
Yes, there are plenty of examples of the children of artists, writers, etc., whose parents, typically their father, in some cases the mother, were just completely absent. And so it's if you're going to have a family and then be unable to emotionally commit to that family, is that a better outcome?
Exactly. And it's not just the men either. Apparently Daphne du Maurier was a horrible mother, and so was Enid Blyton, apparently.
Yes, and
So,
there are several
just
authors, women who had children but abandoned them in some way in order to.
had no interest in them. Yeah. Okay, so Simone, let's talk about her. She's very interesting parallels with the other two. And what is so interesting about her is her sort of, again, very uncompromising search for truth and the willingness to suffer in order to discover or to get closer to the truth. And again, another tie with Catholicism, which is interesting because she came from, again, a Jewish family, didn't she?
Yes, yeah. So those are two very important parts of her character. That she came from a prosperous, intellectual Jewish family in Paris. In her early life, her brother was a brilliant mathematician. He, in some ways, her older brother, he sort of set an example for her. He, as a teenager, was an atheist, and so she decided that the question of God was one that was an important question, but one it was impossible to solve, so she'd leave it behind. And instead
That was a smart decision.
Exactly, yes. Instead she became a very committed left-wing activist. So as a teenager and in her early 20s, she was constantly taking part in strikes and writing for obscure left-wing journals about the pacifism or industrial action, the sort of major sort of left-wing causes of the age. She came from this very middle-class background, but in order to get closer to the working classes, she went to teach in industrial towns. She tried at various times to get manual labor jobs, working in factories, working as a fisherman, etc., etc. And she also, in a most sort of daring search for truth, she went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. She was part of one of the first international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, even though she was terribly short-sighted and she had a personal principled objection to killing anyone. So she would have been useless as a soldier, but happily, I think she managed to step into a pot of boiling oil on her second day at the front and had to be invalided back to Barcelona and then back to Paris. Anyway, I mention all of this partly because it demonstrates the fearlessness of her intellectual inquiry, but also because at the end of these experiences, she began to confront the limits of her own political positions. There was partly her principles were partly coming in conflict with the political reality of the situation. So her pacifism was hard to hold on to in the face of Nazi aggression. But there was also a more philosophical objection, which was a sense that the failings of society that she had identified in this world were real enough. But she began to lose faith in the idea that they could be solved in this life, that there was maybe some sort of socialist future where these inequalities and injustices would be solved. She was beginning to doubt that idea. At the same time, she was suffering from terrible migraines. She went to many doctors, she went to various health resorts, but nobody could seem to help her with the problem. And she too at one point considered suicide because the pain was so intense. The one thing that helped her was listening to Gregorian chant. Something about Gregorian chant soothed the pain. And so we have a disillusionment with her political positions. We have a growing, a slight growing curiosity about the church, and a sense that maybe there's some solution to her pain in the church. And these are the things that bring this young left-wing Jewish intellectual woman to the Abbey of Salem for Holy Week in the year of 1938. And that abbey was the last of the monasteries that I visited. and is where she went on retreat, and where she had an experience that changed her life.
Can you describe that? Or is it just the whole aspect of being in that environment?
Yeah, so the experience that she had specifically was her migraines were as bad as they had ever been. She was attending every single one of the Holy Week services that she could go to. She was sitting and she was listening to the chant. And it wasn't simply the case that when she heard the chant, her pain went away. It was deeper than that. During the Easter week, she would have been listening to the Easter story. This is the story of Christ's arrival in Jerusalem, his trial, his punishment, and his crucifixion. So she's listening to this story at the heart of Christianity. She's suffering from terrible pain. And as she describes it, hearing the chant made it possible for her to, at the same time, imagine that there was suffering in this world, but that there was also a loving God who in some way understood and shared in that suffering. And that perspective on Christianity, that shifted her perspective on Christianity forever. And in the last years of her life, she began writing a series of notebooks and essays about faith and about suffering, which, when they were published after her death, were quickly recognized as probably the most original theological writing of the 20th century, and which have gone on to inspire not just priests and religious thinkers, but poets, documentary makers, philosophers, artists, a whole range of people. Because really, whether or not you believe, Simone Weil offers a new way of thinking about pain and about how to turn pain into something meaningful or beautiful.
Actually, it sounds very flippant, but maybe if you have that perspective, in the sense that if you believe that there are terrible problems in the world which are insoluble, whatever the word is, maybe that is what gave her the migraines. It's like, how could you, because the prospect of that is so terrible that maybe it had a physical manifestation.
I think she was someone who responded very intensely to, first of all, the suffering of other people, stories of suffering. As is the way with all complicated figures, she could be blind to some forms of suffering and then very troubled by others. So that was the first thing she responded.
Selective.
Yes, exactly.
That is a very selective thing you've just described, and we're all guilty of it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That telescopic philanthropy, as Dickens calls it.
That's brilliant.
But then the other thing was she also responded very intensely to ideas. So she writes in a letter towards the end of her life that she has been sort of distraught with her inability to square the circle of a loving and compassionate God and the suffering that we see in the world. This in a way was her great intellectual project. The theologians call it the problem of evil, the attempt to bridge those, to fit those things together. And the effort to do that caused her something like physical pain, because these ideas were so important to her.
Yeah, and her health was not good anyway, was it? She had terrible health issues, as well as the migraines. So
yes, so she suffered from these terrible migraines, but she also ate very little. It's biographers, scientists, scholars have since discussed whether or not she was anorexic. I don't know whether you need to use that word. I don't know whether or not it's accurate or not accurate. I don't know whether you need to use that word, but she had a difficult relationship with food, and there were periods of time where she deliberately ate very little, even though it made her weaker and less well. And the most troubling example of this is towards the end of her life. So she was in France when the Nazis invaded. She escaped from Paris to Marseille with her family. Her family was then able to travel from Marseille to America, where her brother was now living. But Simone Weil was desperate to join the resistance, so she traveled back from America to Britain to join the resistance. She worked under de Gaulle in London. She worked very, very hard. At one point, she collapsed and she was taken to a hospital. The hospital found that she was suffering from tuberculosis, but they were confident that she would make a recovery. She was a young woman. She just needed to eat properly and rest. But she didn't eat properly. She didn't rest sufficiently. Her condition deteriorated. And one of the reasons that she didn't eat properly was that she was troubled by the thought of people in occupied France not having enough food while she was in hospital being given 3 meals a day. And
so it was some sort of very warped solidarity with
exactly. It was, you could say it was an act of compassion. You could say it was a wish for martyrdom or a self-martyrdom. You could say it was a some kind of drawn-out suicide. All of these
terribly misguided, whatever it was, for such a bright person because, no man is an island, and she would have inflicted terrible suffering on other people by doing what she
on her
did.
parents especially. Yes.
And so, I mean, well, let's face it, these people are not who they are because they're always mentally
because
sound.
they're restrained and moderate.
Exactly. But what a terrible pity, because obviously, if she'd lived longer, maybe some of these ideas would have matured further, and she might have had some incredible insights. That
maybe, but there is an intensity to the way that she thought, and there is an intensity to the way that she lived. And I doubt whether or not you could have had one without the other. So the book does not conclude that it's necessary to live one of these sacrificial lives in order to be a great artist, writer, or thinker. Quite the reverse. Nonetheless, we should not be surprised that the people who come up with extraordinary ideas or extraordinary works are themselves extraordinary. I don't think that means they're a model that ordinary people, more ordinary people should try and follow. But I think that does in part explain why they had such devoted, but also such damaged lives.
Yes, absolutely. I was also thinking about, and listening at the moment to Nancy Klein's book, Time to Think, which basically is about how, the quality of the attention you give to someone when they are thinking actually improves their intelligence and improves, and maybe that's really what's missing. If people listened more, didn't interrupt quite so much, and and allowed each other to think, and instead of feeding each other ideas, just listening and prompting at the right moments, maybe you can actually improve the quality of thought in families and in organizations, or and it's a really interesting thought, isn't it?
I think it's one of the things that retreat hopes to achieve. So even if we go on retreat for a few days, a short period of time, even if the retreat is simply, to an upstairs bedroom, not to some religious community, if that retreat includes a deliberate attempt to separate ourselves from everyday life, which probably includes switching off phones and putting away social media, and a deliberate attempt to pay attention and to understand ourselves without all of the markers of status and the trappings of everyday life that normally form part of our identity, then I think that capacity of attention can improve, and maybe with it,
And you get better
sorry,
you get better ideas,
and maybe with
you?
it you can get some ideas or insights that wouldn't be possible otherwise.
Yeah, that's really, anyway, I loved your book. I think your writing is just to call it great is an understatement. You write extremely well, and you've captured something about all of your subjects, which is really unique, I think. And I think you chose them very well. What are you working on at the moment?
Well, thank you very much for that. That's very kind. At the moment, I have 2 projects. One is fiction, and the other is non-fiction. And I'm trying to decide which of them should be taking most of my time and attention.
Can't you split your time?
Well, maybe that is the solution. To go against the example of these 3, maybe trying not to simply commit to one thing, but have several things on the go.
Well, I find that if you hit a wall with one project and you just put it aside for a bit and go and work on another, your subconscious mind works on the problem that's been bedeviling you on project 1. And when you go back to it, you come back to it with fresh eyes. Yeah. So
I'm sure that's true.
Can you describe your projects, or would you rather keep them under wraps?
I think I'd rather keep them under wraps at this early stage. Okay, they're still just little seeds that I'm waiting to blossom.
Well, when you're ready to talk about them, do let us know. I will, and then we'll invite you back.
I'd love that.
So it's been such a pleasure talking to you. And actually, just for background, I should have said this in the intro. I actually met Guy at a local, I live in Oxfordshire, and there's a local place called Art and Talking, run by the very eccentric Michael, who's a very, he's a great guy, very interesting. And that's how I met Guy. So Michael invites interesting writers and speakers to come and talk in our little town. And that's, and sometimes those develop into podcasts like this one. So anyway, thank you, Guy. It was really such a pleasure chatting to you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Inkspot podcast. Please like, subscribe, and comment. We love to hear from you. And please check out the books featured or mentioned in this episode, which are all linked in the description below. To all cooks, dog walkers, drivers, and anyone bored out of their gourd, we'll see you next time.